Good morning. It's Richard Heald at the UK India Business Council. I'd like to welcome everyone who's dialed into this webinar this morning. Indian elections 2014. It's great to have James Crabtree on the line giving his views and perspectives of the Indian election, the likelihood of the formation of the government, and the likelihood as to what the agenda and what we may expect to see in the first 100 days or so. For those who don't know, and I can't imagine there are very many, James is head of the Financial Times Mumbai, has been writing articles out of Mumbai for about 2.5 years. And previous to that, he's had a very distinguished career in Prospect magazine, as well as various other publications. He was advisor of the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, etc. And latterly, James has actually embarked on a new career, which involves an entry into Bollywood, where he has just appeared as British diplomat #2 in a film under production in Mumbai. But let's go back to the day job, and James is going to give us his views. But first, I've got to run through certain specific instructions for everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to familiarize you with the toolbox on the right-hand side of your screens. Just to let you know, we have everyone on mute during the course of the webinar to keep any background noise to a minimum. But if you have a question, please drop it into the little bracket on the toolbox to your right in the please type your question here box. Just send me your questions and I will take it up with James during the Q&A at the end. But for now, to make sure you can all hear me correctly, could I please ask you to use the raise your hand button on the toolbar. Can you please click the raise your hand button? Okay, thanks. Right, I'm going to ask James now. He's prepared a presentation, which hopefully will be on your screen, and we'll run through that. And then that will last for about 15 minutes, and then we will be able to ask James your questions and to receive his answers. James, good to have you here this morning, and I leave it all to you now.
For having me. Oh, very good. I think I've now been unmuted, so thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction. I wasn't expecting my extremely brief and liable to be left on the cutting room floor Bollywood debut to be mentioned in this presentation, but there you are. You can see a slightly different representation of me on the screen in front of you, which was painted by the FT's cartoonist Ingram Pym when I got this job 2.5 years ago. So let's crack on. Next slide, please. It's sort of the calm after the storm at the moment in a funny way here in India. The election last Friday was a real earthquake, although since then actually not very much has happened. What we expect to happen now is that Mr. Modi is going to get sworn in. I think the latest date is now Sunday or possibly Monday. I can't remember exactly when it is. But until then, he has been conferring with his allies and pondering what he's going to do, but not actually giving very much of an indication so far. So for we nervous journalists, it's been a sort of slightly peculiar period, given we expected him to get cracking very quickly. It is worth, I think, just pausing to consider the magnitude of what happened last Friday. As Richard said, I arrived here 2.5 years ago. You learn pretty quickly in India that there are certain iron truths of the way India is governed, that the government in Delhi is relatively weak, that it is a coalition government, it doesn't work very well, that often the power in the country is held by the states, and almost all of that was swept away last Friday in a result that was much, much more forceful than really any of us expected. Next slide, please. On this, here you can see what the result was. I'm sure you're all aware of this, an absolutely thumping victory for Mr. Modi's party, and it is particularly worth pausing on what a dreadful performance for the Congress, who scored less than Mr. Modi's allied parties and almost as little as a couple of the regional parties. Next slide. The result of all of this looked at on a map of India is what you see before you, an orange wave. Orange is the BJP position, and the little tiny patches of blue are the remaining bits of the Congress. So, I mean, that is what a Modi wave looks like, completely dominating the north and west of the country, with only patches holding out in the south and east for regional parties with a few little bits of Congress. Next slide. I thought I'd put this in just for fun, that this was something that went around on Twitter the day after, showing a historical parallel, although, as I say, I add this for jest rather than to make a serious point, but it does show the depth of Mr. Modi's unexpected victory. Next slide, please. So what has happened since then? Well, the markets have gone completely haywire. This is a graph that we had in the FT a couple of days ago. It shows you what's happened to the Sensex since the beginning of the year. It hit another all-time record on the election day. I think yesterday was a closing record. And clearly this result has delighted international investors and the business community, who now expect Mr. Modi to get down to business. And I thought I would divide the remainder of what I was going to say into two halves, which is, it seems to me that there are certain things that he will be able to do relatively easily, although not easily, and some things that are going to be more difficult. So, so next slide, please. What we expect to happen over the next week is that Mr. Modi will announce his cabinet, and in particular the crucial position of finance minister. India has demonstrated, at least on 2 occasions since I've been here, how important the right choice of personnel can be in the appointment of the current finance minister, Mr. Chidambaram, who was much better than his own predecessor, and who, despite the difficulties of the previous Congress government, or the current Congress government, was a much more effective operator. And then secondly, last September, with the appointment of Raghuram Rajan at the Reserve Bank of India. And so whoever he picks as his finance minister, whoever the person is, then that could make a big difference. At the moment, the money seems to still be on a BJP politician called Arun Jaitley, although there are various other names being gossiped about. One of the oddities of Mr. Modi is that because he isn't of New Delhi, and his people are not of New Delhi, actually the New Delhi establishment has really got very little idea what's going on. And so there's a lot of people gossiping with the base of very little knowledge, and all decisions are really being made by a very small group of advisors from Mr. Modi's home state of Ahmedabad. Anyway, so the first set of immediate problems is to begin to fix the dysfunction in New Delhi that has led in particular to the phenomenon of stalled projects. This is something you hear about a lot about in India, power plants that don't have any gas or any coal, road projects that are half-finished, industrial facilities that are either half-finished or completed but for some reason aren't operating. And it is fairly widely assumed that Mr. Modi will do something about that. However, you know, his room for maneuver on the bigger picture of the economy, the graph on the right here, is pretty limited. I mean, there's no way in which he can begin to spend money to boost economic growth, and there isn't really any way for Raghu Rajan at the RBI to cut interest rates. Next slide, please. This gives you a sense of these the stalled projects, which people talk about a lot. It is a huge problem, and in particular, the graph on the right explains what has gone wrong with India's economy over the last couple of years, which is that capital investment, gross fixed capital formation is what this measures, has basically collapsed. And getting that starting again, firstly, means beginning to fix some of the investment projects that are half done or done, and getting them going, and then beginning to convince the private sector that it is time to start investing again. Those things are going to be very difficult to do, although as I say, most people assume that Mr. Modi, who has a reputation as a very astute administrator, will be able to move forward on some of the problems on the graph on the left on stalled projects. Next slide, please. The final thing I thought I should mention on the immediate problems where I suspect there is going to be some progress are a couple of the larger things affecting foreign investors. The picture on the bottom left is of an Indian scene involving Vodafone, and probably most of the people on this webinar will have followed Vodafone's tax case in particular, and also the problems that many other global businesses have faced with the Indian tax office. My suspicion is that Mr. Modi is going to find a way of fixing this. I think there's a sort of sense in the air that he recognizes that this has been a big problem, and he will find a way of making this go away. Quite how it happens, I'm not entirely sure. The second one I thought I'd mention on the top right, BP also have been engaged in a long-running row as part of a partnership that they have with Reliance Industries over gas pricing. That I also think is a sort of regulatory problem which Mr. Modi will find a way of fixing relatively quickly. Next slide. However, you know, when looking at either his first 100 days or longer into the future, there are a number of issues that are going to be much more difficult to fix. And I think even with the size of his mandate, you still have to be relatively sanguine about the depths to which India's economy has sunk over the last few years, and therefore how much effort it is going to take to begin to clamber out of that. I mean, certainly the idea of suddenly going back to 8 or 9 or 10% growth over the next couple of years seems to me to be fairly fanciful, and also, according to most of the economists we speak to, you know, and here is in front of you on this slide just a very basic problem, which is that India has, you know, is a dreadfully difficult place to do business. It just has got slightly more difficult according to the latest rankings, but it ranks very lowly, and trying to move forward across all the range of different issues that make up an index like this, from how difficult it is to start a business to how difficult it is to get basic infrastructure, that is going to require, you know, a long and sustained campaign from the new government. It's not something that's going to get fixed quickly. Next slide, please. The country remains corrupt. And while Mr. Modi has talked a lot about corruption in the campaign, it's not very clear what exactly he plans to do about this. There are moves that natural resources may be auctioned rather than allocated, for instance, but quite how the BJP plans to lessen India's problems of corruption is not really clear. It's a problem that actually goes across much of their economic policy, where their manifesto had a lot of broad objectives but very little indication of actually how those objectives would be reached. And I mean, I was speaking on the weekend to one of Mr. Modi's closest economic advisors, who all but admitted that, you know, that a lot of the details of these plans remain to be worked out. Next slide. Another problem that is pressing and difficult that I write about a lot in Mumbai for the FT is the nature of the banking system, and in particular the state of corporate India, where while there are some excellent companies who have done very well in the last period, the industrial companies, the industrial conglomerates in particular, a lot of them are in terrible financial states, and this has had a very bad effect on the banking system. There's very little chance that there's going to be banks falling over. However, if you want to start investing in infrastructure, getting the investment cycle moving, it's not entirely clear how you do that when a lot of your largest infrastructure companies are technically bankrupt, and a lot of your state-backed banks require massive infusions of capital, much larger infusions of capital than your fiscal deficit is going to allow. Next slide, please. There's one other problem Mr. Modi faces. That the picture on the left is of a regional politician called Jayalalitha, with whom many of you might be familiar. She is the cantankerous populist chief minister of the southern state of Tamil Nadu, fond of putting posters of herself all over the state, and in particular in the capital, Chennai. You can see the one at the bottom shows her being felicitated by a peculiar photoshopped ménage of world leaders. However, Mr. Modi's first call upon taking office was to Jayalalitha, a reflection of the fact that in order to get major structural reforms through, he needs the support of other parties in the Indian upper house, where the BJP has nothing like a majority. It only has about 60 of 250 seats. And so if he wants, as he says he does, to pass some major reforms, particularly in areas like labor regulation, land acquisition, these sorts of things require you to cobble together a coalition in the upper house, and therefore you need support from politicians at the state level and other minor parties. Equally, as the graph on the right shows, an awful lot of the barriers to growth, whether that's installed projects or reform of the tax system, a whole range of things that actually end up being implemented by chief ministers at the state level. And therefore Mr. Modi needs some of these rather difficult chief ministers to work with him. He has an advantage that there are a good number of friendly state ministers from his own party, but equally if he's really going to introduce far-reaching structural reforms of the sort that will get growth, that could potentially bring growth to a much higher level, that's a barrier. So next slide. And then we come to in a sense, the biggest problem of all that I think, and we at the FT have come to the conclusion that India faces, which is what is often called its demographic dividend or potential demographic disaster. India's population, as most people know, is growing very strongly. This graph is just particularly striking that almost all of the addition to global workforces over the next decade are going to come from India, somewhere on this projection from Goldman Sachs, between 65 and 110 million workers. And the real problem, which you can see on the next slide, I think, if we go to the next slide, is that it's not at all clear what this big influx of workers is going to do, because India has such a lousy record of producing labor-intensive manufacturing industries. India is very good at making cars, car factories, high-tech manufacturing where you use robots rather than people. But for the sort of manufacturing that made every other Asian country rich, or at least a middle-income country, whether that's garmenting or food processing or consumer electronics, India has a particularly woeful record, and in actual fact is getting worse, is getting quite a lot worse over the last few years. You can see the graph on the right-hand side, which shows how little of India's economy is made up of manufacturing industries compared to China, and the fact that it is declining and potentially could be continuing to decline. And unless Mr. Modi finds a way of fixing that, then in a sense it's quite difficult to see the model which India is going to follow to become a middle income and a wealthy country. I mean, you can't simply rely upon software and services. That would be a little bit, as a peer of mine put it, a bit like turning India into a Gulf oil sort of monarchy, in which you have sort of wealthy service sectors that are meant to provide the wealth that are handed out to everyone else who isn't working, which is a very unfortunate sort of image of the future. And so tackling this problem of manufacturing is really crucial. Next slide, please. And the only other thing I thought I'd highlight is the relationship between India's state and its business leaders, I think, is another unsolved question, and one that happens to particularly interest me. The picture on the left is of Mr. Ambani and Mr. Mittal. On the right is Mr. Ambani's house. Over the last few years, you have had an extraordinary increase in wealth in India. A lot of it concentrated in the hands of these very powerful business figures who often have or have had historically quasi-corrupt relationships with the government. It's not at all clear how Mr. Modi is going to handle this, because on the one hand he has said that he is going to help Indian business getting its projects off the ground and helping it to invest, but he has also said that he's not going to be corrupt. And so that, I think, is an interesting, much bigger picture issue about the nature of Indian capitalism. Next slide. And so where does all this leave us? I thought I'd put this slide up just to remind us where we've come from. I mean, at the moment we are in a peculiar Indian moment of great optimism, probably the most optimistic moment that I've been in. It is worth remembering that as the graph on the right shows you, it was only 9 months ago when India appeared to be about to fall off a cliff, and indeed in currency terms it did. And so I suppose that's just to say that the path forward is unlikely to be smooth. Next slide. What we're really talking about here, the difference between an effective, oh sorry, I forgot about this slide. This is also just to say that just to show sort of where India has come from, namely the fact that it wasn't that long ago when it had this yawning current account deficit. Things have now improved, but who knows what might happen in the other direction. Next slide. The difference between a sort of radical reforming government and one that is slightly less good is to be found on this chart, and I think this is from Morgan Stanley. Their bull case, I think, is very optimistic, but nonetheless the notion that you could get back up to 8% really requires the solving of those more difficult issues that I outlined. And then final slide, I mean, I suppose it's worth, again, another chart just showing the bigger picture here of what is happening. My colleague in the Financial Times this morning, Martin Wolf, wrote a rather good op-ed trying to just pull back from the details of Mr. Modi's cabinet and what he's going to do in his first 100 days and to try and sort of put what just happened in its proper picture, which is that if Mr. Modi can indeed achieve that bull case and reform the Indian economy to the point where it grows at 8% a year, and thus where you can see what that means in terms of its GDP over the next 10 years. It would make an enormous difference, but it would also be part of lifting a huge number of people out of poverty. Martin's argument in his piece was that if something like this does come to pass, you can begin to make the case that what just happened last Friday will have been one of the most electorally significant moments in human history. That if by giving Mr. Modi a mandate which allows India to grow at the type of rate that is indicated on this chart, that you can make a sensible argument that that is one of the most significant things that's ever happened in the history of mankind, given that given the number of people who live in India and its potential importance to the future of Asia and the world in general. Now, whether that's going to happen, who can tell? But we will begin to get a down payment on that over the next week or two, when we begin to see how radical Mr. Modi is going to be in terms of spending the political capital that he has been given, and how willing he is going to be to move beyond the first set of relatively easy issues to solve that I mentioned, and to begin to start solving some of the second, much more difficult challenges that India faces. And with that, I will hand over to Richard as our chairman.
Unmuted.
James, thank you very much. That was a masterly expose. Just points of clarity here while we line up the questions. There is no question that obviously BJP have got an absolute majority in their own right, but they will be including NDA other members of the NDA alliance within the cabinet.
Yeah, as far as we're aware, at the moment we haven't had a sense of who the cabinet ministers are going to be, but no, I think the couple of our allies, the Shiv Sena, who are our party here in Mumbai, and the other two or three that they had, I think they're expecting to be given cabinet positions. There has been gossip about whether or not Mr. Modi might try and go for, in a sense, a super NDA and rope in a few other regional allies, even though he doesn't need them. I think that is rather fanciful, although who can tell? It would be a very sort of Blairite gesture to try and do something like that. But I suspect he has he has what he needs, and that some minor positions will be handed out to these parties, but all the ones that matter are going to go to the BJP.
Unmuted.
Thanks. The analogy of a Blairite gesture from Mr. Modi is somewhat confusing to my mind, but I'll try and work that one out later. In terms of, as you rightly say, where we are at the present moment is there's a huge degree of optimism and expectation as far as the incoming government is concerned. One could almost argue that the expectation can only result in disappointment. But clearly, the size of his majority, the fact that so many of the young people of India voted for him, aspiration is going to be absolutely huge for him to deliver, and that is only going to come through increased economic growth. To a large extent, that economic growth has always within India been funded by FDI flows into and that the encouragement of those FDI flows. To what extent do you believe, bearing in mind that this had been a very personality-driven election with little policy being discussed, to what extent do we know as to what the incoming NDA government priorities are on FDI, around things like retail and finance, etc.?
Well, what they've said is that they are not going to do anything more on retail. The BJP historically has had a lot of popular support from small retailers and shop owners, and so for reasons that are never entirely clearly articulated, they've decided that that as a project is something that they don't want to touch. The policy as it had been conceived was such a complete failure anyway that only a sort of thoroughgoing rethinking would have helped. However, they have indicated in their manifesto that all other areas ought to be open to FDI, and so there aren't actually all that many areas left that are barred. I mean, defence. We've begun to hear rumblings about insurance, that you might get 100% FDI in insurance, which would be interesting if it was true. I mean, as I say, this is all just gossip at the moment. But no, I mean, I would expect them to be relatively open to FDI. I think the question is more almost on the other side, which is, given all of the problems that foreign investors have faced in India over the last 5 or 10 years, are they going to begin to make large-scale investments until there has been some down payment on the fact that the country is going to be slightly easier to do business in? I mean, I suspect we aren't going to see a flood of new foreign direct investment, in particular in the more troublesome sectors that India needs. I mean, what India could really do with is FDI in things like power and infrastructure, and that's where foreign companies really don't, or even oil and gas. And beyond BP, there are very few foreign players in oil and gas because it's just so difficult. So I think India remains a very attractive, very large emerging market. There are a lot of companies out there in the West with a lot of cash on their balance sheet looking for growth opportunities. So I think, they are relatively sanguine about the risk-reward profile of being in an emerging market. So I think it is perfectly possible that you see a lot of investment, and you have seen that from some companies like Vodafone or Unilever, Glaxo, even before this election. However, I think if Mr. Modi can begin to make real progress, convincing people that tax isn't going to be an issue, beginning to reform some of the problems that make India such a hard place to do business, I think then there will be much, much more FDI waiting to come in, and I think that's the real opportunity. But I see no sense in which the BJP are likely to be against foreign investment.
Unmuted.
That's interesting, and the fact that you raise the issue in relation to tax, because that's been well, I'm not even sure I describe it as a slow-motion car crash, but it has been a major issue as far as people's perception mean, Modi and some of his colleagues in the BJP and NDA have been quite outspoken in relation to issues surrounding tax terrorism, etc. How receptive do you think they would be to the international community's concerns in relation to clarification around these tax issues?
I mean, I think they recognise that this has become a problem, and that the lack of predictability in the tax system is something that is becoming damaging to India. Now, I'm not quite sure what they're going to do about this, and the problem is that while foreign companies, and to an extent even perhaps foreign journalists, tend to see the Indian tax authorities as 100% the bad guy in this. They're sort of acting capriciously and being very unfair. India does have a problem, which is that the type of foreign investors that come to India are very good, not necessarily at avoiding tax, but at minimizing tax. And as more and more of your tax take comes from global companies, you have a problem that they describe as erosion of the tax base. This is a respectable sort of concept that the OECD have written about. And so it's a balance. I mean, I suspect that they will try and find a way of reining in some of the worst offences of the different tax offices around the country, and in particular trying to bring some of the more high-profile cases involving not just Vodafone but IBM and Nokia and Shell and whoever else to a conclusion. So this just goes away, and people remember that kind of paying your tax in India is more painful than paying it in an industrialized country, but not the be-all and end-all of doing business here. And I as I say, I think this is a pretty solvable problem that Mr. Modi will be able to make go away. I'm fairly optimistic about it.
I'm muted.
You highlight the kind of fiscal problems and the lack of the ability for Modi and the government to address this. But he does have certain levers or arrows in his quiver, and there has been discussion recently flagged up by Deepak Parekh in Mumbai in particular in relation to the options surrounding expansion of the disinvestment program into something that we would in the West regard more as privatization. That would certainly liberalize up the economy and also address, be a substantial fillip towards the fiscal deficit. I mean, what's your view on that?
When the BJP were last in power, they did make quite a lot of progress on what here is called disinvestment under a minister called Arun Shourie, who's another potential slightly longer shot candidate for the finance minister, who's one of the BJP's leading intellectuals. And so I think there's a chance that some of this might happen. Mr. Modi's instinct, so people tell me, and what he did in his home state of Gujarat was not to privatize the state-backed utilities, in things like gas distribution and power. It was simply to run them better and to appoint professionals to their management, stop having them run by kind of political cronies, make them more accountable. So I think he will certainly try to do that. Will he do things that are more bold? I mean, I wrote a story last week about the banking system, and there has been a bit of movement in the undergrowth about whether or not the BJP might begin to sell down its stake in some of the state-backed banks. I mean, the state-backed banks are typically not terribly competitive relative to their private sector peers. They have all sorts of problems, but in particular they have a very expensive recapitalization bill, which I mentioned during the presentation. One way around that is to begin to sell down that stake, not to completely privatize them, but to keep a golden share, for instance, so that you still control them, but maybe sell down below 50% to 25, 26, something like that. It's possible. I mean, a lot of people think that this is politically not possible or not something that Mr. Modi is going to want to do. And I suppose it'll be a test of his instincts. Much more interesting is whether or not he will begin to do things like breaking up Coal India, the state mining colossus, which is horrendously inefficient and badly run, or privatizing Air India, the airline, which is also horrendously inefficient and badly run. These are not things that people talk about as top policy priorities. They're more kind of a glint in the eye of some of his more far-reaching advisors. But I think there certainly, were he to begin to start talking about that, then you would have a sense that this really was a government that was willing to be even more radical than people had anticipated.
Unmuted.
If we can return a little bit towards to FDI, if you look historically at the way, say, the Vajpayee BJP government operated, there certainly was a willingness to be business friendly, but quite often that business friendliness was directed more towards, how can I put it, domestic corporates than international corporates. I'd be interested in your feeling as to whether, if you like, the nationalistic elements that underpin BJP and /NDA could be exposed in such a way. The second element that I have is there was a very interesting, and I'm sure you're very much more aware of it than I am, but there's a very interesting symposium that took place in April in Delhi, in which Modi was alluded to movement in retail in due course. Clearly, it is an issue as far as BJP is concerned, although we have to admit that they were the first ones that proposed it back in pre-2004. But Modi made a comment in relation to the way the world was moving, and that domestic retailers had to recognize this and the advantages, both in terms of efficiency and in terms of profitability. So, if you like, it's superficially we have certain red lines in the sand, but actually, what is the fundamental policy of BJP and NDA on this?
Well, as I say, I mean, their official policy is pretty clear, which is that they're not going to do it. That doesn't necessarily mean they won't rethink it, but I think it would be unlikely that they're going to do that in the short term. And then there's a secondary problem, which is the reason why people focus such a lot on FDI retail. I think comes from two sources. One, that anyone who lives here realizes that the lack of a kind of modern sort of retailing and shopping infrastructure is one of the big differences between India and even most other Asian countries. But also the thing that the people who proposed the policy hoped was going to happen was that, in a sense, Walmart or Tesco would somehow come in and, by the dint of their economic might, would begin to reshape and refashion the way that India's agricultural supply chain worked, so that that would have all sorts of ancillary benefits, because they would develop systems of, cold chain logistics or making farming more efficient. That all sorts of things would flow if you could only get sort of big box retail to come in. And I think that as the retailers have looked at what that requires, even they realize that this might be something that Walmart and Tesco can do in the UK if you already can come in and plug yourself into a relatively efficient supply chain. But the way that India's system of agriculture works, from the growing of onions to spices to whatever, is almost literally medieval, and therefore I think that the notion that FDI retail in and of itself would be this revolutionary step is something that perhaps seemed more plausible a couple of years ago than it does now. I mean, that's a wider point. But I'm not sure I would expect a kind of a reversal on this in the short term. In the medium term, clearly, India does need to develop a sort of modern retailing sector, and more policy changes, I suppose, will be brought in to facilitate that, whether foreign or companies like Reliance in the domestic sector. As to whether India will be nationalistic and favour its own companies, I think that's inevitable. I think you'd also see that in the UK at the moment with the reaction between Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Whether or not the BJP in particular is somehow going to be more nativist in its regulation than the previous government, I don't see any reason to fear that in particular. As I say, insofar as Mr. Modi has said anything on this, which largely he hasn't, or insofar as it was in the manifesto, they have said that they're welcome to FDI in all sectors apart from retail, and that in particular in areas where foreign companies can bring in better technologies or better techniques that India needs, then that they're going to be open. So I think there is good cause to be optimistic on that front.
Unmuted.
James, thanks. I have two further questions that I'm wanting to ask. We've got a vast number of questions here. I have to say I can't address all of them, but we will revert with answers to those people who specifically asked the questions. But the final two questions I want to ask, one is on bureaucracy, and the other is I'm wanting you to polish your crystal ball, James, into what we can expect in the period before the budget. But the first one, in relation to bureaucracy, clearly we've seen one of the things that have underpinned Modi and the NDA's election win here has been his introduction of systems in Gujarat, which has at least ostensibly speeded up decision-making process, introduced transparency, and reduced relative levels of corruption in the interface with government and the bureaucratic process. To what extent do you feel, and we have seen already some indications that he intends to streamline certainly the cabinet structure, to what extent do you feel that he can introduce that effectively, efficiently, quickly, demonstrably in Delhi, or to what extent do you suspect that Delhi may actually influence him and he'll be thwarted or frustrated in that process?
I think it's a very good question, and the assumption here is that the way Mr. Modi used to work in Gujarat, from what people tell you, I've never seen it firsthand, is that when there was a particular problem, let's say you're Ford, the motor company, and you want to build a factory in Gujarat, as Ford are doing at the moment, then instead of a process in which the necessary permissions are sort of sent from one department to another on pieces of paper, and people object, and then they write letters to one another, and it all takes months and months. Basically, he would get everybody in the same room and force them to talk to one another, and then tell them to come back the next week when they'd got everything together, and it would all be done. That's part of the Modi myth, but as far as one can tell from going up to Gujarat and talking to the companies who operate there, there's a good deal of truth to it. I have never, I think I can say this straight up, but I've never been to another place in India where people have done anything other than complain about how difficult it is to do business, whether that's the manufacturing areas in Tamil Nadu or Pune or those around Delhi. Everyone's full of complaints. In Gujarat, typically nobody has anything but praise for the administration. It's a very remarkable difference, regardless of where you stand on the debate about the Gujarat miracle. It is very clear that there's something different about the way that he has operated there. Now, can he transfer that to Delhi? There are reasons to doubt, I suppose. Firstly, the type of decisions that you are taking are rather different. And you also have to deal with a much wider range of stakeholders, I suppose you'd have to say, to use a dread word. However, if this is, as I said in my presentation, this is the smallest of the things that he has to do right. Being able to efficiently coordinate the machinery of government in order to get decisions taken more quickly is, in a sense, the least of his problems. And so I think that with those caveats that running a country is not the same as running Gujarat, and you have to be sort of canny and engage in clever statecraft, I think he will be able to make quite a good difference, and that you might that the Indian central government, that has been kind of perceived to be in a sort of state of almost permanent stasis and decline, actually may suddenly become quite efficient if whipped into line by somebody who actually wanted to make it work. So as I say, I think on that one, I would also be relatively optimistic, although that comes with the further caveat that, as I say, that in a sense is the least of the things that he has been elected to do. So if that proves to be more troublesome than we anticipate, then the rest of the optimism, I think, will prove to be well overdone.
Unmuted.
Well, James, we're in a kind of honeymoon period now, and I suppose that will last until the budget is set down, and possibly after that. What should we be looking for in this period of time to maintain the positive momentum that we have here, both from a structural point of view? What are the key elements that you would want to see in the formation of the cabinet that would give you comfort, and what would you like to see in terms of announcements around policy during the period into the budget, again, which would reinforce the positive feeling that we have? Admittedly, okay, we all know, and in fact I think he's come out with a statement today, that Mr. Modi's ambitions run beyond a 5-year term. They run onto a 10-year term, so we're in here for the long haul. But this is a critical period in which you can formulate public opinion, and he is in a honeymoon period. So what would you like to see during this period?
I suppose what I'd like to see is pretty much what Governor Rajan did when he came into office last September, which is that very quickly after having taken office, he gave a very comprehensive speech outlining his reform agenda that covered a whole range of things that you would have expected and a whole range of things that you didn't, if you see what I mean. I mean, he stated his claim early to be a radical reforming central bank chair who was both going to act upon some areas where you would expect a central banker to act and then some more where you wouldn't. And I suppose the best case scenario is that Mr. Modi does something similar, that he will keep Mr. Rajan on at the RBI, he will appoint sensible people in the most important economic portfolios, and that he will then he will then give a sort of broad overview of what he actually intends to do, which both covers some of the easy wins to do with restarting investment, reassuring domestic investors and foreign investors alike about the type of treatment that they would like to receive, but also gives a broad sense of some of the objectives that he is likely to pursue in the longer term. And that, I think, will be enough initially. I mean, when Mr. Rajan came, nobody expected him to solve inflation overnight. I mean, the point was that if you give a sense of where you're going, then you begin to make a down payment on that, and you begin to tackle some of what everybody inevitably here calls all of the, you don't tackle low-hanging fruit, you pick low-hanging fruit. No, but if you begin to kind of pick off some of the low-hanging fruit, but give a clear sense of direction on some of these longer-term issues, and I think that's enough to begin to change sentiment about the country and justify some of the optimism that is built up in financial markets. So that's what I would be looking for, and I think probably my presentation gave the sense of the individual things that I suspect that he needs to deal with. I think that's all relatively well understood. There's a long. One of the advantages of India's position, in a funny way, is that because the growth situation is so bad and because the list of problems is so long, that actually Mr. Modi ought to be able to make progress with relative ease. Because there are so many problems, that just means there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to pick. And so again, in the short term, I think, I'm going to be surprised if he turns out to be a complete disappointment. And I think with his mandate and his reputation and the very long list of things that clearly need to be done, I think his first 100 days ought to go relatively well. The question is really about these longer-term issues, which are much more politically troublesome, require grappling with the difficult nature of delivering structural reforms in a country this large and this complicated and with this many sort of state-level politicians. I mean, that's the most important thing, and that's the thing that we'll find out only more gradually how adept the new Prime Minister proves in those areas.
Unmuted.
Okay, James, one final curveball, if I may. I saw that I think it was today, that AAP are going to be contesting there's going to be a new Delhi elections. Clearly, the AAP made potentially a fundamental and possibly fatal flaw in terms of resigning from the Delhi government in order to fight the national elections. Do you think that position is rescuable?
It's a very interesting question. I'm not really sure what I think about it. I mean, the point that they made was that they didn't actually do all that badly for a potential national party in their first election, that when the BJP fought their first proper national election, they also only got a handful of seats, and they made breakthroughs in different parts of the country. Nonetheless, I think it would be fair to say that their leadership was very disappointed by what they managed to achieve, and certainly given the discussion in the months preceding the election about what might happen. I mean, I had some respected people, one of whom I shall not name, but who told me that he thought the AAP would get 60 seats. However, there is clearly a gap in India. If the BJP is a right-of-centre party, which broadly it is, then there is a gap for a centre-left party. And with the Congress with only 44 seats in Parliament, and some very searching questions about its own future and leadership, it seems to me that the Aam Aadmi story is not yet fully run, particularly if Mr. Modi begins to govern in a certain way. And by this I mean that it doesn't seem to me, as I've said, it doesn't seem to me to be, it seems like Mr. Modi is going to have some success restarting the economy, getting these projects moving, sort of clearing some of the roadblocks, and so on and so forth. But the slide where I showed Mr. Ambani's house and his picture, that broad question about whether or not India can sort of develop a new type of capitalism that is more productive and less corrupt, that seems to be much more of a sort of open question. And if Mr. Modi begins to look like he is doing favors for sort of particular tycoons, or not delivering on his promise to end the type of corruption that is quite deeply ingrained in all sorts of different Indian business processes, then Arvind Kejriwal remains a very adept campaigner and politician, probably much better than anyone else other than Mr. Modi, and I would expect him to exploit that. So while I think there has been a bit of a disappointment about how the Aam Aadmi have done, I wouldn't count them out just yet.
Unmuted.
James, that's great. Look, thank you very much for your time and your insights. We'd obviously love to get you back again in due course to kind of have a sanity check as to where we are. In relation to everyone who's on the line, I would encourage you to log on to James's blog, which, as I was speaking to James earlier this morning, is something I read even before I talk to my wife in the morning. James, I don't know if you want to give us your, the blog, the email address or the web address.
So I should say this is not actually a blog. This is just an email list that I send out of some of the things that I write on. So if any of those listening would like to receive that, then do just drop me an email. My email is james.crabtree@ft.com, and I'd be happy to send you some of the things that I write.
Unmuted.
And if you didn't get that, then please just come on to myself or events at ukibc.com. We'll delighted to hand that over. Look, thank you very much for everyone's time. As I said, we only scratched the surface of the questions that we were asked. We will revert on answers on all of them. I hope the webinar was valuable to you. It certainly was to me. And if you have any feedbacks or comments about today's session, or you want to see what we're going to be doing in the future, please feel free to get in touch. In the meantime, again, James, thank you very much for your insights and contribution, most useful. And for everyone else, thank you very much for joining us. And I wish you a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.